So, welcome everybody to this open class. Welcome people at home. This afternoon, I want to discuss with you a recent phenomenon in the world religions, namely religious populism. The phenomenon grows as science and knowledge take hold of society. The academic approach of theology and tradition in particular is more and more suspected. One feels today that the old-time religion is changing. A critical approach to scripture and to tradition becomes the same as disbelief. One should not think about fate, they say. You just simply have to accept what Jesus has said and done. Don't think about it, accept it. Now, such viewpoints which pit simple folk faith against elitist theology, that is called religious populism. So in order to talk about such a phenomenon, it's important to provide the context. And this afternoon, I will first introduce religious populism with some figures and statistics, and then elaborate the thesis that the concept is the object of an inner contradiction, what we call a paradox. So in order to distinguish between pure faith, the old-time religion, and the current reflection on it, one appeals to the idea that the ancient conceptions are absolute and universal. But these views must not be tempered, they say. But the same absolute and universal values are rejected when it comes to science and knowledge. Populists say, religious populists say, gravity is not absolute according to them because Jesus could walk on water. Or miracles are revelations and they show that the law of nature is not universal. God can expand it. Populism divides the truth into real, that is divine truth, and false, that is human truth. That division is the basis of religious populism. So this is why this lesson is a part of our general theme this year, namely religious diversity. How are we going to deal with that? How are we going to deal with other religions and philosophies of life? How do we appreciate the truth that is equally absolute from traditions other than our own? So this is the main question underneath this lecture. When you divide truth in a real one, a pure one, and a false form, you stimulate exclusivism. This means that you divide the world in good and bad, in real and false truth. So when we will highlight the phenomenon of religious populism, along the way, I also want to pay attention to the specific Belgian context in which we live, and especially how we deal with diversity. So I will show that the Belgian modus vivendi, so how we do it here in Belgium, with respect to philosophical diversity, offers an ideal starting point for dealing with religious diversity worldwide. I will call it the federalized approach. So those who think that nothing works in Belgium can revise their opinion, because our federal model proves to be a fertile breeding ground for appreciating a plurality of truth. These are the main topics for this afternoon. First, an exploration of the recent phenomenon of religious populism. Second, I will provide some tools for appreciating the plurality of truth. So, if everybody agrees, we can start. But sometimes pictures say more than words. So I will start this lecture with some pictures. Now, this is one. Ain't that something? There's another one. And maybe the best one of all. No, no, no. It is. Idolatry. This is the best one. Religious populism. How did it come so far? How did a marginal movement 2000 years ago became a tool of hatred, discrimination, commerce? Now we first look at some figures, some statistics, to have the framework of this lecture. Worldwide, 8 out of 10 people identify with a religious group. A major study conducted in 2012 by the Pew Research Center in more than 230 countries estimates that some 5.8 billion people identify with a religion. 5.8 billion people. That means approximately 86% of the world population. The study of Pew also shows that the Christian religion still is has the largest number of adherents. It's the main graphic of that research. You see, Christians, 31% of the world's population, Muslims, 23%, unaffiliated, 16%, and Hindus, 15%, and then some smaller religions. Now we must have some depth in those figures. It's worldwide. Christians are not one part. It's 31%. That's almost half Catholic, the other half Protestant, Anglican, and then a small part Orthodox. That's about the same as unaffiliated, as we can see. 16% Catholics, 16% Protestants. Muslims, the same. You can divide them in 2 big parts. 23%, almost 60 of those 23% is Sunnite, 30 Shiite, almost roughly, and then some smaller groups. Even in the unaffiliated category, we have some different dimensions. Most people who say they are unaffiliated, that doesn't mean they don't do anything. They just say that they don't want to be part of a church or a mosque or whatever. They don't want to be institutionalized. They don't want to be part of an institution. So that's a big nuance, but the big picture is there. And what's interesting in this study is that they also provide, from those figures, some prognosis. And the biggest prognosis is already now 86% of the whole world population adhere to a religion. It's gonna rise the coming years. It's gonna rise, it's gonna enhance the religious adherence because of fertility. Pew Research Center saw and calculated that the biggest part of the people who adhere to a religion are in the South, in the Middle East and Latin America, Africa, India. And they have the biggest fertility. The West, northern part of the world, had less children than the southern parts. So religion gonna grow in the coming decades. That's a fact. That means, and that's the other one, that due to fertility, Islam in 2035, it's a prognosis, will be the largest religion in the world. If you can see, 232 million Muslims, 226 million Christians. That's a prognosis, extrapolating from the figures from today. These recent forecasts show that the role of religion in the world will not diminish, but increase in the future. Now, that's important. For people from Europe, it's not natural. I mean, for us, it's counterintuitive. Because when we walk around here in Europe, in Brussels, everywhere, and we ask people in the street, do you go to church? Do you believe? They say no. 9 out of 10 will say no. Maybe 1 will say, yes, I do that. For us in Europe, it's counterintuitive. So we see a rapid decline in religious adherence. At the same time as we see a rise in outspoken atheistic or agnostic worldviews. The reason is that Europe is an exception. If you see it worldwide, Europe is the exception. Even compared to the United States, Europe is still an exception. The statistics show that the decline of Christianity in the West is in line with the increase in religious populism. And that's what that study also shown. In the first big picture of the world religions and the adherence, we see the rise of religion in the world the coming decades, but we also see a switch. That's the next one. Voila. Sorry. Religious switching, they call it. And what you see is that especially Christians, that's the West and the North, is switching to unaffiliated. Almost the other religions stay fairly the same. So that's what we see in Europe, of course. The religious switching from Christian tradition to unaffiliated. Now you can provide some arguments for that. You know them. Institutions fail in their social networking. So Europe is an exception, and we have to keep that in mind when we study and when we do theology and religion here. Europe is an exception compared to the rest of the world. However, in spite of these statistical results, the importance of religion in Europe is also increasing, even if it's counterintuitive for us. We can show that religion in Europe is again high on the agenda, mainly because of migration. That's the biggest figure. There's other channels as well, but especially migration, also the new forms of religion. You have some ancient cults that come back to the fore and are practiced again. So that's the situation worldwide. So let us now focus a little bit on our situation here, because there's one more important notice that we have to take in mind. That is that the dialogue about religion, when we speak with people about religion, about belief, you can always feel a certain tension towards sensitiveness towards Islam. That's since 79, the Iranian Revolution in Iran, the Iranian Revolution with the Ayatollah. 10 years later, the fall of the Berlin Wall. There are some tensions there, especially when we go a little bit further to 9/11, that tension became hostility. When people talk, just people, not educated religious theologians, but when people talk about religion, they immediately think at Islam in a negative sense, in a hostile way. That's a very sensitive topic. Excuse me. So we see religion is growing in the world, and religion is again high on the agenda, also in Europe, with a certain tension vis-à-vis Islam. Now, these global developments have created a very special climate in Europe between liberal democracy and religion, liberal democracy and especially Muslim communities. In Europe, therefore, politics have roughly two approaches to that problem, to the growing religious adherence and the tension with Islam. Oh, I always go to the wrong direction, excuse me. Here's that's a book, that's the cover of a book by sociologists of religion, Peter Berger, very known, Grace Davy, very known, Anglican, yes. And they studied those problems worldwide. And it's just to give notice from good book, you can buy it. The two main approaches to the problems we live in today, you can call them, easily said, radical secularism or moderate secularism. There's the two main approaches in Europe vis-à-vis religious thinking, religious adherence, and the religious worldview. The radical secularism is that beautiful woman on the left of the screen. It's France, c'est la laïcité. The radical secularism is the idea that we should expand religion out of the public life. The public life, politics, nothing has to do anything with religion. If you want to practice it, do it on your own, at your home. Secular radicalism, radical secularism makes a strong division. La laïcité en France. A resolute separation of church and state. On the other hand, there's a moderate secularism. We can observe that in the UK, in Germany. There, the state says, okay, we have a tradition somewhere deep in history with religion, and we want to keep it like that. So representatives of the religious denominations in our country can be there in official ceremonies. And the state said, okay, and we will protect you a little bit. We will finance you. That's moderate. You don't have to do anything for the state. We'll take care of that, secularism, but we will give you a representative status and finances. Moderate. UK, Germany, France. Two big approaches. This is the bigger framework that now the figures and the ideas around that we can now move and go to Belgium. The curious case of Belgium is that the two approaches I just came to explain, the radical and the moderate secularism, those two approaches are here present in one country. That's the curious case of Belgium. We have in the same small country the two approaches. You can say, in a way, that Belgium is Europe in a nutshell. Europe in small. This does not always make it easy for outsiders to understand. Therefore, I'm going to explain it a little bit. Belgium is a federal parliamentary democracy. Federal parliamentary democracy. And above all, a monarchical state structure. There's a king. So we have a federal parliamentary democracy with a monarchical state structure, with a king. On top of that, we have three regions: Flanders, Wallonia, Brussels. On top of that, we have three languages: German, French, and Dutch. So as far as the ideological policy is concerned, the more radical view of secularism is sustaining the policy in Wallonia, the French-speaking part of Belgium. The more moderate secularism, the radical laïcité en Wallonie, the more moderate secularism provides the policies in Flanders, in the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium. They are supported by a traditionally Catholic pillar. So in Belgium, as in the rest of Europe, a more than considerable increase in migration had led to a growth of Islam as well. So now we have that picture of Belgium in complete accordance with the world's religion situation in the world. So let us now look at some figures of Belgium. That's our little country here. Stadbel. I don't find those figures out of in my thumb. I look it up, and Stadbel calculated that this year, 2021, there we had 11,520,000 inhabitants. 11,520,000. Of that 11 million, almost 60% is living in the yellow part of Belgium. They call it Flanders. 60%. 30% in the purple part of Belgium, Wallonia, and 10% in that little dot in the middle, Brussels. So you see, Brussels is a part of Flanders, if you look at it geographically. But that's not the point here. In Wallonia, in Brussels, we start there. So 60% of the inhabitants of Belgium live in Flanders, 30% of Wallonia, 10% of Brussels. But in Brussels, the smallest part, that yellow, no, not yellow, that green dot in the yellow, 1 out of 3 inhabitants of Brussels have an immigration background. 1 in 3. That's 1/3. So that's almost 33%. 10% in Wallonia. 10%. 1 in 10. 5% in Belgium. 1 in 20. In Flanders, excuse me. So, regarding those figures, the population increase in Belgium is 0.5%. Not too much, not too less, 0.5%, but 0.4% is due to migration. So fertility in Belgium is very low, 0.1% yearly. Most migrants, and that's interesting as well, most migrants who come to Belgium settle in Flanders. While from the population in Brussels, like I said, it's 1 in 3 is already from a foreign background. So economically, so we have some figures now, I know, but it's necessary to provide the right facts. Economically, there are also big differences. The unemployment rate is above Belgian average in Wallonia and Brussels. While in Flanders, it's obvious, it's the other way around. The unemployment is above Belgian average. The employment rate in Flanders is approximately 80%, where in Wallonia 65%, in Brussels 60%. So see, economically, there's also a difference in this little small country of ours. Fourth element regarding to Belgium, it's surprising, maybe, or maybe not, for those who know Belgians. It's surprising that there are no official figures on religious adherence in Belgium. We don't ask each other, what do you believe in? We don't do that. We are therefore assigned to foreign sources, and once again, Pew Research Center is at our service. They calculated the religious composition in Belgium, between 2010, 2050, so the coming 30 years. I know they're fairly small, but I show it just for some switches that you see worldwide is also the case in Belgium. In 40 years' time, Christians will diminish with 1 million. Muslims will rise with 500,000, just like the unaffiliated will rise with 500,000. Hindus, a little bit, all the rest fairly stays the same. That's the prognosis for the religious adherence in Belgium. So what I want to do with those figures and statistics is to place the current situation of religious diversity in Belgium, in Europe, in a global perspective. So now we have those figures, we can roughly conclude on 4 points. On the global perspective on religion, that means in Europe, it means in Belgium as well, we see, first of all, the importance of religion in the world is increasing. It's a fact, figures show. Secondly, religion is, again, high on the agenda worldwide, although religious adherence in Europe is declining. as I called it, counterintuitive. We don't, and that's maybe one of the main challenges for European scholars, not to think Eurocentrist. It's very important if we talk about religion and the meaning that we are not Eurocentric. We've been that for too long. That's the second bullet here. Religion is high on the agenda, if we want it or not. Although it is declining, counterintuitive. The third point we can conclude from this global perspective, we must, in the future, we must discuss the workability of a radical or a moderate secularism. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Are we going to ban religion out of the public life? Or are we going to keep it like it is, sustain it? We have, globally, we have to put our minds around it regarding the future of humankind and culture. And the fourth, the last conclusion could be the future of religion depends on global demographic shifts. As I explained, due to migration, we have to be aware that religion itself is changing due to migration. These 4 points of conclusion we draw from the figures and statistics makes it possible now to turn to our main topic for this afternoon, namely religious populism. Religious populism as a result of those 4 points. It's a reaction within religion against the evolution that we're facing. So, what we just saw concerning policy, concerning a radical and a moderate secularism, is also relevant for the attitude within religious communities. The thing is that the reactions within religion is going in the same direction as politics go. It's very strange to see. Within religion, you can hear voices saying that we should defend our tradition. We should defend our heritage against the failing modernity, against scientific dominance. Within religious communities, you can hear that we have to be aware of modern world. I call this the exclusive discourse that divides the world in a good and a bad part, in a real and a false truth, like I came to say in the beginning. So in the political arena, that standpoint saying we have to defend ourselves against the tides that are coming out of the world. In the political arena, there is the standpoint of conservative and right-wing politicians. They say we have to protect, we have to defend, we have to be aware. On the other side of the spectrum, there stands the inclusive discourse. No, diversity is a good thing. It's better for men. It's better for culture. That standpoint is held by left liberal politicians. It's in that part of the discussion that enters populism. Internationally, there's a political scientist, a Dutch political scientist, he's called Cas Mudde, who's an expert in populism and radicalism. Cas Mudde, here he is, that's Cas. He provided together with other researchers, colleagues of him. He published numerous studies, and he provided the academic world with a solid definition of populism. So there's the definition of populism right here on the screen, next to the picture of the inventor. 2 points, Murder says, are special at the case in populism. First, it is a tin-centered ideology. I explain what it is, tin-centered, that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic camps: the pure people versus the corrupt elite. It's the first thing. Populism divides the people in two homogeneous, antagonistic camps: the pure against the corrupt. And second, populists say that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, the general will, of what the people wants. That's populism. A division between a pure and a corrupt part of the people, and politics that should voice what the people, the pure part, wants. In the light of this dual definition of populism, it is clear that the voice of the people is elevated above all else. It's elevated above criticism, even above ethics. This is of great importance in understanding the relationship between religion and politics. Several researchers point out that the voice of the people, the general will, the voice of the people is always linked to an anti-pluralistic standpoint. In some strange way of thinking, populists say that the voice of the people, without critic, is always linked to an anti-pluralistic standpoint. In this thinking, identity is linked to a religious tradition. Identity is linked to a religion. This means that, be it Catholic or Protestant or Buddhist or whatever, the populist thesis is that a true Belgian is a Catholic or a Christian. A true Indian is a Buddhist or a Hindu. Identity and religion are, in the populist worldview, linked to each other. That gave us some very strange situations. For instance, France, La Douce France. Oliver Roy, that's a sociologist of religion, points out the ambivalence that characterizes the use of religion in populist movements. And he took, as a research topic, he took Le Front National, de Marine Le Pen. And he saw, and he wrote it down in a brilliant study, Marine Le Pen, Le Front National, uses Christianity, first, to oppose Islam. Second, at the same time, she criticized the institutional churches as being too liberal, especially on migration. And third, at the same time, she denounces conservative church morality around sexuality, for instance. And she denounces, the fourth point, the same movement in the same rhetoric. She denounces the French political elite, Macron. It's very strange. So how did she do that? Oliver Roy, in that study, points, therefore, he says, voila, that's Oliver Roy, French sociologist. He said, religion matters first and foremost as a marker of identity, enabling them to distinguish between good us and bad them. So also Roy sees the very tight connection between identity and religion in a populist worldview. Christianity, as a national identity, Roy said, is so tin-centered that it can be easily hijacked. So that's, again, the tin-centeredness of religion. What does they mean with this? They mean that you can be, for instance, you can be a Christian without believing in the virgin birth of Jesus. You can be a Christian, but I don't believe the Trinity. I don't adhere to the Trinity, the dogma of the Trinity, but I'm a Christian. It's very tin-centered. You can move around with it. That's why religion is most of the time easy to be hijacked. The same is true for Islam, but in reverse. Even Judaism, they're very strict. As a man, if you're not circumcised, you're not a Jew. You're a Jew. So populist parties oppose migration, and they use a barbaric image of Islam according to their rhetorics. For instance, we know that rhetoric very well. They say, look, the Christian culture is civilized because we went through the Enlightenment and Islam did not, so they are a sort of pre-civilized phase. It's complete nonsense, but still they use it again and again. This thinking gives rise to a form of Christianism, as we see in the US. Mind the bumper stickers I saw in the you saw in the beginning. This form of Christianity, we also see it in Europe, we see it in the Netherlands, we see it even in the UK. And strong underscoring in that form of Christianity an anti-Islam rhetoric, but also anti-other groups. So these studies show that religion plays in the identitarian and anti-Islam focus. We're Christian, so we're against Islam, something like that. A real Christian is against Islam. This is the populism that I'm describing. So the problem that we are facing today concerning religion, it is the so-called pure belief. What is a pure belief? In a way, if we see it globally, and in terms of society at the time, within diversity we are facing, that pure belief is unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's here that religion enters into the sphere of the implausibility. Therefore, they have to denounce science. I can give some examples. It's easy to do. And one crucial year in that tendency that I'm describing is 2016. 2016, nobody knows, but when I will explain it, you will remember 2016 is the year that President Trump was elected, and in the same year, the Brexit was voted. 2016. And then you see some interesting tendencies. What we see is how in the US, 2016, the politically active right-wing evangelical movement was a strong support for Donald Trump during his campaign. Whereas this was not the case in England. Strange. In the UK, traditional Anglicanism voted for Brexit, and the evangelical movement within the English churches were pro-European. See, tin-centered. You can hijack easy. The evangelical movement in America supported Trump. The evangelical movement in England was pro-Europe. That's the tin-centeredness. So consequently, what I mean is when we think now around our topic in a theological way, the notion of the sacred people, the pure people, if you want to, and the values of that people makes it possible for populist movements to turn against two enemies at the same time, against the elite and against the other, against mainstream politicians and against migrants. It's very easy to do. Both threaten the politicians, mainstream politicians and migrants, both threaten the sacred values of the people. The sacred values of the people established in our identity, they say. So religion, both in its original dynamic, as we know from Emil Durkheim, the original dynamic, I talked about it, students will know, I'm very Durkheimian. The original dynamic of Durkheim says the tribe, the people always represent their organization into the sacred, into the totem, into the cathedral. That's the original dynamic of religion. That form, but also the substantive dogmatic form, the confessions, 4th century, those both forms, representation of the organization, or the dogmatic form, facilitates political populism. Both forms. These lines of connection between religion and populism should alert theologians, and we are all theologians. It should alert us, and especially church leaders. It should alert them not to allow themselves to be taken for a ride. That's the problem we're facing today, what I call religious populism. So before we go to Belgium, again, we'll have some conclude. Oh, no, I always take it upside the cup. Religious populism. Again, 4 points, 4 bullets to conclude this second part. Firstly, the global perspective on religion teaches that religious developments run parallel to geopolitical tensions and globalization. We can't take religion out of politics, and we can't take politics out of religion. That's the first point. Second, we see an increasing polarization in the worldviews today. We see it every day, in which identity is opposed to diversity. We see it every day. The polarization today, it's a populist polarization, even in the debate around COVID, where people give their opinion and say that a vaccine is not fitting their identity. I'm not like that. I'm a natural person. So an increasing polarization in worldview we see, in which identity is opposed to diversity. A third bullet, a third point is, that's important, as a marker of identity, we know it, we've seen it, the very close link. As a marker of identity, religion is closely linked to an exclusive political discourse. We must be aware of that, especially religious leaders, especially theologians. And a fourth point is both the original and dogmatic forms of religion, as I saw Durkheim representing, and dogmatic confessions form of religion facilitate political populism, which we call, if they go along with it, religious populism. So let us now return back to Belgium. Oh. The specific and curious model that emerged in Belgium is due, I think we all know, due to historical language conflicts. Now, for our topic, it is important to note that ideological and social conflicts are contributed to the political system that prevails today. I will briefly sketch the genesis of our state structure with special regard to the religion, how we managed religion during the past 200 years. Now, before independence, 1830, Belgium, before that, Belgium was a Catholic region. Catholic. After the French Revolution and the separation of church and state, the church accepted Napoleon's Concordat. What was in that? The church relinquished political influence in exchange for recognition and support. That's mainly, roughly, what happened there. The church relinquished political influence in exchange for recognition and support. So, freedom of religion was enshrined in the Belgian constitution, whereby, of course, the first church to be recognized was the Catholic Church in 1830, followed by Judaism in 1832, and then Protestantism, Anglicanism in 1870. They were recognized and supported by the Belgian state. Now, during the 19th century, two major trends were important. First, the industrialization of Wallonia. The industrialization of Wallonia, which brought prosperity. They brought prosperity, but at the same time, ideologically, those first industrialization managers were French-speaking, anti-clerical. Laicite. In Flanders, 19th century, still largely agricultural, the population stayed loyal to the Roman Catholic Church. That progression in Wallonia, progression in Flanders, status quo, that was the foundation of the Catholic pillar in Flanders. It still is in a certain way today, although it is diminishing. But the Catholic pillar in Flanders had a lot of possibilities by building schools, hospitals, social services, and a powerful political party that remained in power uninterruptedly. The Catholic Party, from the 19th century on, way up until the 80s or 90s even, the Christian Democrats. So the two big conflicts in Belgium being language, French, Dutch, and ideology, laicité, Catholic, those two main conflicts were high and remained high on the agenda during the 20th century. Remarkable for the 20th century in that focus is the two school battles we had in Belgium, where the Catholic pillars strove for religiously inspired education in the mother tongue, while the state schools took the more liberal secular stand. Two school conflicts, they call it the schoolstrijd. As a result, and that's interesting, as a result of those conflicts, the freedom of religion was increasingly emphasized during the repeated constitutional revisions. Due to those conflicts, the Catholic pillar in Flanders always brought to the table the point of religious freedom. They always kept it right in the center of every constitutional revision, staatshervorming. As a result, during the second half of the 20th century, new religions could claim recognition and support. So I mentioned already Catholic, Judaism, Protestant, Anglicanism. Islam was recognized in 1974, Orthodox Christianity in 1985, and non-confessional free thinking, de vrijzinnigheid, non-confessional free thinking in 1993. And last but not least, Buddhism in 2008. Now still in progress is Hinduism and Syrian Orthodoxy. They still apply for recognition. Now, the latest state reforms in Belgium have shifted more and more competences from the federal to the regional political level. For us, it's interesting because the increasing immigration has made integration policy the competence of the region. Added to that conception, the Brussels region was constructed only in 1989. Before it was Brussels capital, now it's the Brussels region. For those who still follow, we have some parliaments here in our country. Now, what's the point? What we see then is that Belgium had become, the last 50 years, what I call a patchwork, in a way, a federalized patchwork. You see, a patchwork in which different models shape the whole. Like a blanket with different fibers and models, but they form one patchwork. So there's no, and that's important to notice and to know, there's no Belgian model. Like I said, it's a patchwork of different models. So I suggest to use in the future the term of a hybrid methodology. Belgium uses and is due to a hybrid methodology in balancing diversity. And that's interesting for us because I believe that that model, that hybrid methodology in balancing different ideologies and worldviews can be a very fertile breeding ground for global perspectives. So the curious case of Belgium is interesting in many ways. And I will focus now on the religious diversity and how it is managed in our federal construction. So I just said the model, the patchwork, is modeled by a hybrid and devolved federalism. There's one overarching framework, and that overarching framework is the Constitution, and that is repeatedly underscored with religious freedom. That's the whole patchwork guarantees, the overarching framework guarantees religious freedom, and where even recognition and financially report are given, but not without conditions. Not without conditions. We saw in the beginning of this lecture that the conditions are variable along the lines of a radical and a moderate secularization, a secularism. In Flanders, for instance, most churches and mosques, in order to be recognized, has to prove in documents 3 things. In order to be recognized, a church or a mosque or whatever has to prove in documents, first, that they will use the Dutch language in Flanders, the Dutch language as a lingua operandi, that they will speak Dutch in church or in the mosque. That's the first rule. I know, you already know it's very ethnocentric, because they won't look at the Anglican church if they preach in Dutch. They will look in the mosque if they will preach in Dutch. But it's a variable, moderate form of putting conditions on religion. It's the first thing, the Dutch as a lingua operandi. The second, they have to prove in documents that they will respect the Constitution, the basic rights and liberties. Dutch, basic rights and liberties. And the third one is obvious, that they don't engage in violence or terrorist activities. That's obvious. So that's the 3 conditions they put on religion in Flanders. Like I said, it's very variable. That gives some interesting cases here. I mean, when it comes to neutrality, the debate regarding headscarves or other religious symbols in the public space. Very interesting. In the 2 parts of the country, they make more or less the same decision, but they argue differently. In Wallonia, for instance, the radical discourse of a strict separation of church and state is used, but they say you can't wear a headscarf in public spaces, but, and that's the other part, where we see it in Flanders, people tend to modulate their arguments according to the position they occupy. This means that in Belgium, in that hybrid methodology, there's no overarching, there's no overarching ban on headscarves. It doesn't exist. There is a ban on the niqab that is everywhere in Europe, but not on the headscarf, not on religious symbols. There's no overarching ban on it, but there's the freedom there's the opportunity, there's the space to take measures depending on the situation. For instance, in Antwerp, you can't wear a headscarf. In the city hall. In Ostend, you can. In Ghent, you can. In Leuven, as well, not in Brussels, and it's constantly moving, and that's why I call it a hybrid model, which at the same time is very flexible. So this situation in Belgium confronts us with a specific theological problem. And I want to make some comments on that. You know already by now you should know what I mean by a hybrid, flexible, federalized approach to religious diversity. That hybrid, flexible, federalized approach is under pressure as we speak. As I described above, the recognized religions can lean on a long-standing political goodwill from the time Belgium was born, 200 years. The long-standing political goodwill vis-à-vis the recognized religions. But despite the various historical and moral debacles that have taken place over the past 200 years, freedom of religion remains an unshakable constitutional right. That's a good thing. Freedom of religion stays unshakable, constitutional. This includes financial support. But in two different waves, after the two world wars and due to recent migration, the share of free and indigenous churches and religions grew significantly. So the recognized institutions that enjoy that goodwill are now being placed in concurrence by the free and indigenous churches and religions that come into the public life. A not unimportant recruiting argument of these free churches, besides the ethnically determined sociality, is the reproach that the traditional churches compromise with political and moral liberalization. The free churches say to the established denominations, they say, you're not real anymore. You have made too much compromise to the state. In other words, a form of competition has developed within the religions and denominations itself. So now, with the flexible approach to diversity, like I just came to say, the patchwork, the hybrid methodology, with that approach, politicians are getting more involved in religion than they asked for. They made that patchwork with the idea of, then we don't have to involve, and we don't want to be involved in the religious thing, the moderate secularism. But they are now, because it is competition that fuels populism. Theologically, this means that religious leaders emphasize what is called parochial altruism. Parochial altruism. Now I have to hold it right. No, well, Belgium. Yeah, well, we've been through that. Parochial altruism. An Austrian theologian, Wolfgang Palaver, interesting articles he wrote, he coined the term. It's a well-researched mechanism, especially in anthropology, in cultural philosophy. It demonstrates an ethnocentric closure of humanity within the boundaries of the tribe of the own group. What does it mean? We all know the concept of, I think we all know, René Girard. René Girard, who said, in order to keep the coherence into the group, to strengthen the coherence in the group, they find an enemy, a scapegoat, le bouc émissaire. And they send the bouc émissaire, the scapegoat, into the desert, and the group is again reorganized and well tied together. That's the idea. And now what we see, religious communities do the same. Especially in that form of competition. They organize a sort of collective enemy, modernity, liberal churches, scientific theology, all the things that are bad, but we keep away from that all. And what we see now recently, and therefore I focused on that populism, it's augmenting, it's getting more and more, because those communities that use that parochial altruism are growing. It's an important thing to know. So the modern state is the enemy because they are too easy with diversity, with migration. Consequently, the federalized governments of diversity in Belgium requires decision makers to assess the religious message. They have to come and listen in a way to what people are saying in the mosque in order to know what they are doing, in order to give recognition. But the state can't go and listen to the churches and the mosque because of the religious freedom. So here we have a paradox, the paradox of religious populism. So, to counteract that mechanism, to counteract that problem, the religious leaders are not sitting still. They established the known churches, the established and recognized religions in this country regularly organize inter-religious dialogue. It's very worthy. I think it's very interesting as well. It's very needy to keep the peace, but, and I must be aware what I say, because my good friend Jack is here in front of me and he's part of that inter-religious dialogue. Like I said, it's very worthy, it's very helpful, it's very needy to keep the peace, but theologically, it's very tin-centered. The theology of inter-religious dialogue is not promising. Why? Each person tells his or her viewpoint and the other ones listen very politely, very civil. But I believe that today's reality of increasing religious diversity requires more creativity and more commitment than a friendly exchange of opinions. Added to this is what the French anthropologist Pascal Boyer calls the tragedy of the theologian. And that's interesting for theologians as well. The anthropology coined a term, they called it the tragedy of the theologian. This means that people who have learned, who have educated, who know the Bible, who know the Quran, they can exchange on a very enriching way. They can understand each other very well. But once they come back to their communities, they have to preach what the people want to hear. You can have a very enriching debate with theologians, with religious leaders, with intellectuals. Sorry if I use that term wrongly, but still. But once you go back to your parish, you have to preach what people want to hear. That's what Pascal Boyer calls the tragedy of the theologian. The theologian can't preach today anymore. Almost impossible to preach what his expertise says. He has to preach what the people want to hear. And that's a very, I think it's a problem for theology. It's a problem for the church as well. That what the people want to hear is called the pure gospel. People want to have the pure gospel and not scholarly fuzz. So this brings me back to the beginning, to the bumper stickers, what people want to hear. And this is why, in conclusion, I plead for a proclamation of religious traditions based on scientific insights, based on scientific research. I plead for that because in the modernist worldview, it is science that sets the tone when it comes to the origin of the universe, to the origin of life on earth. It's science who sets the tone. In a globalized secular society, it is impossible to reach, that comes, second point, it is impossible, in a globalized secular society, it is impossible to reach a moral consensus on religious grounds. You have to be aware of that. It is impossible. The one group says, according to the old text from 3,000 years ago, you have to expand homos out of the society. Another group says, no, you have to do this. And it's impossible today, on that ground, to have a moral consensus within secular society. You must be aware of that. Science and human rights, because that's what it is, demands a pluralistic approach. They demand a pluralistic approach and consequently a relativation of the religious representations. So the specific expression of religious truth is different in each religion. The global reality of religious diversity obliges every tradition to rethink itself in the context of a greater coherence and equality, in the context of sustainability, and, of course, in the context of human rights. We have to rethink our tradition in that context. It's not the other way around. It's impossible the other way around. If institutions want to survive, they have to be creative and honest. if they don't want to bog down in religious populism. So that's the point I wanted to make this afternoon. So herein lies also the relevance of religious traditions in a globalized secular society. What I want to say as closing statement is that the world out there, I think, needs theology, not religious populism. And to make it a full inclusion, we end where we started. I thank you. Thank you for your attention.